Well, welcome everybody. My name is Suzanne Switzenberg. I'm a librarian at the Lewis and Clark Library in Helena, Montana. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Lewis and Clark Library's Fireside Chat with authors Simon Winchester and Jim Robbins. Jim and Simon will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session with the audience. Please write your questions using the Q&A feature. You can also do that during the interview and afterwards. Now about our esteemed guests. Simon Winchester is the acclaimed author of many books, including The Professor and the Madman, The Men Who United the States, The Map That Changed the World, and Krakatoa, all of which were New York Times bestsellers and appeared on numerous best and notable lists. He is an officer of the Order of the British Empire and lives on 123 acres in New England. We are delighted to also have veteran journalist Jim Robbins with us this evening. Jim has been a freelance writer for more than 30 years. He has been a frequent contributor to the New York Times and has written for numerous magazines from Condé Nast Traveler to Smithsonian. He has carried out assignments around the world and is the author of several books of nonfiction, his latest being The Wonder of Birds, What They Tell Us About Ourselves, the World, and a Better Future. Tonight, they will be discussing Winchester's latest book, Land, How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. Whether meadows or mountainsides, desert or peat bog, parkland or pasture, suburb or city, land is central to our existence. It quite literally underlies and underpins everything. Employing the keen intellect, insatiable curiosity, and narrative verve that are the foundations of his previous best-selling works, Simon Winchester examines what we human beings are doing and have done with the billions of acres that together make up the solid surface of our planet. This book examines in depth how we acquire land, how we steward it, how we fight over it, and finally, how we can, and on occasion do, come to share it. Ultimately, Simon confronts the essential question, who actually owns the world's land and why does it matter? Thank you both for being here tonight, and Jim, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, Simon, I want to tell you how much I enjoyed the book. You cast this wonderfully wide net around the world, looking at things from China to the US, to Montana, where I live, just England, all around Europe. It reminds me in some ways of my own kind of interests that are broad, and wherever you find a good story, you get to stop and rest and write about it. And I think that's what I enjoyed most about it.
Well, it's a great relief to me that you enjoyed it, so thank you.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, it's not about the book, but on your book jacket, it says that you were made an officer. You're originally from London, is that right?
Yes, I was born just north of London, but I grew up mostly in the west of England.
It said that you were made an officer of the Order of the British Empire by Her Majesty the Queen. Now that's something I wish I had on my resume that I don't, but I'd like to know just a little bit about what that means and what that entitles you to.
Well, it doesn't entitle you to very much. And indeed, now it's almost an embarrassment because empire, as you know, is very much out of fashion these days. So there are moves to suggest that it should be renamed the Order of British Excellence, so to get away from this whole empire connotation. But basically what happened was one day in, I think it was 2005, I was on a book tour, rather like this, I can't remember what book it was, and there was a telephone message from the British consul in Boston. Would I call him back? And I thought, oh my gosh, well, I will, but I'm sure it's just, would I go and speak to the Chamber of Commerce or something, and I'll leave it for a few days. A few days went past and I'd sort of forgotten, and the message came, it's imperative that you call this chap. And so I did. And he said, Simon, my job as consul is generally not very interesting, not very pleasant. We've got the Gulf War going on and there's all sorts of sort of bilateral issues between Britain and the United States. But occasionally things happen to us which are very pleasing. And the following is one of them, and you might want to sit down. And I thought he was just joking. So he said, no, sit down. And I said, okay, just to humor him. He said, I am commanded by Her Majesty the Queen to inquire as to whether if you were to be offered the officership of the Order of the British Empire, you would be minded to accept? And I said, you've obviously got the wrong person. And this is not... Anyway, it went on and on and on. And in the end, I said, well, of course. And then he made this wonderful remark. I said, well, am I allowed to tell my wife? And he said, until the Queen has confirmed this, which will be in about 5 days, you're not to tell anybody at all. Of course, you're dying to tell everybody.
All right.
And I said, well, can I tell my wife? And he said, well, this is a question commonly asked. And the view is that Her Majesty's government has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. So anyway, then I went to London and there was a big ceremony and I got this medal.
Wow. Well, very, very nice. Congratulations. And it looks good on a book jacket. And I'm not going to ask any questions about Harry and Meghan, so don't worry about that. Okay, this is a big topic, how land has shaped world history. I mean, give us in a nutshell, why is land important to shaping the history of the world?
Well, there are 37 billion acres of habitable land on the planet, and they have been divided over the centuries into countries, and the shapes of those countries have been either decided by the existence of big rivers or mountain chains, or that separate groups of people one from the other. But the whole business of division and the shaping that changes as politics changes in various parts of the world, it operates at a granular level too, between adjoining farms or between adjoining towns or villages or counties or states or smaller countries. And so the whole question of shape of the entities in which we live is determined by the land on which we live. And I thought the way I organized the book is essentially in 5 main parts. I mean, I did a prologue and I did an epilogue, but the 5 main parts were, in order to own land, you've got to know where it is. So you've got to survey it, you've got to map it, you've got to measure it and do all of those good things. And so the whole business of cartography completely fascinates me. It had anyway from childhood. And then how do you acquire land? I mean, do you steal it? Do you fight for it? Are you given it? Are you gifted it? Does it always require bloodshed? I mean, in this country, an awful lot, of course, stolen from Native Americans, and it did require bloodshed. Or are there places where land was created, and I go into some detail in a situation in Holland where land was dredged up from the sea, it didn't belong to anybody, which is now a huge and important part of the Netherlands. And then once we've got the land, how do we look after it? I mean, do we steward it properly, or do we pollute it? Do we disdain it? Do we revere it? Do we treasure it? And then this whole question of ownership. I mean, can we own it? And should individuals own it, or should communities own it? So, well, as you say, it's an extremely big subject, but because it literally underpins everything we do and everything we get from it, I mean, the clothing that both you and I are wearing today, the things I can see on the shelves behind you and that you can see on the table behind me, all of them come from the land. I mean, geology or agriculture or whatever, it all comes from beneath our feet. So it's a fascinating subject. And I hold no particular brief other than that at university I studied geology. And so I was very interested in what makes the solid surface of the world. So on a whole number of levels, it's a subject which completely intrigues me. And yes, quite literally shapes where we live and to an extent shapes us.
And land ownership, I mean, they even brought God into the picture by saying that God owns the land. Can you talk a little bit about that concept and how that played into ownership?
Yes, if I were to own land in England, and my family never owned land until shortly before my parents died, and they had a small house in a county in the middle of England called Rutland, and they had maybe, I don't know, a tenth of an acre of a garden. They owned it, and they owned the house. And once they owned it, they could do with the house more or less as they pleased. I mean, they could sell it to someone else, they could rent it, they could borrow against it, do a zillion and one things. But they owned it, and this is not unique to Britain, but it is unique to many old countries. They own it in what is called fee simple. And that's a weird sort of medieval term. What it actually means is that the real ultimate owner of all the land in the United Kingdom belongs to the Queen, or the monarch. Happens to be a queen at the moment. And the reason for that is that is the ancient belief that all land in the United Kingdom, or in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, belongs to God. And as the Queen, archaic this may sound, the Queen is God's representative on earth, so she owns it on behalf of God. And I can own it in what is effectively a lifelong tenancy. And I can do with it, my house or my garden, as I please. I can sell it and do all the things that I mentioned at the beginning of this. But deep, deep, deep down, I don't really own it. The Queen does. And this is true in many other countries with monarchs. It's true in, for instance, Imperial China, that the Chinese emperor in the Forbidden City in Beijing was seen as the agent of the deity on earth, and he owned on behalf of that deity and could then parcel it out as he pleased. Politics, of course, came into play, so it's now a communist government in China, so all of that theory goes out of the window. But basically, the biggest landowner in the world today is the Queen of England, because she owns all of the United Kingdom. She owns substantial parts of Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The people who live there don't really know this, because, or at least it never invades their consciousness. It's not an inconvenience, except if you, and this is true too in the United States, but for slightly different reasons, you think you own something, but if you don't pay your taxes, ultimately, it's taken away from you by the state. So do you own it, or does the state own it? And then it gets all muddled. Another reason why this book, I found as I dug deeper and deeper into it, totally intrigued me. The subject is fascinating. And of course, a lot of lawyers make a great deal of money out of land disputes, particularly between neighbors. It's interesting at the moment, there's a court case I was reading about in England yesterday, a place called Esher in Surrey, which is a very wealthy part of south of London, full of stockbrokers and bankers and so forth. Two houses, each of them many millions of pounds worth of real estate. There is a hedge, a laurel hedge that separates them. And on one side of it is a tennis court belonging to the householder in that particular house. He took it upon himself to trim this hedge, meaning that people playing tennis could see through the hedge into the swimming pool of the people next door. I feel so sorry for these people. They sued and said the hedge was actually on their land. And this went to court. A distance of 2 feet was what was being argued over.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I think the people with the swimming pool lost, and they had to pay their court costs. And it all amounted to about £100,000 to determine the integrity of a border and 2 feet. So people get very, very squirrely about this kind of thing.
Mm.
Sorry, did I answer the question somewhere in there?
Oh, yes, you did. Yes, very, very nicely. And there's more to these big concepts of land and who owns it, who should own it. One of those is terra nullius, is that right?
Indeed, terra nullius, yes.
Tell us what that means and why that's important.
Yes, very, very basically, the idea, once again, an English idea, and we deservedly take the blame for a lot of these inanities in matters relating to land and settler colonialism and so forth. The view is that if you discover, and I use that term in quotes, if you discover a continent and there are no people on it, then it's yours for the taking. So you fetch up in a country, in a huge island like Australia, and Captain Cook and his chums map it, a very good map maker, and come back to England and say, we've discovered this great, enormous piece of land. And the people in the colonial office said, well, that's marvelous. Are there any people there? And the answer effectively is, well, there are some creatures there. I wouldn't call them humans. I mean, you and I would call them humans, but in the days of empire, they were not regarded. They were regarded as beasts, effectively, which enabled the lawyers to say, well, in that case, it's not inhabited, so we can take it. And this happened, of course, in this country. It's a blot on American history.
The lawyers.
Yes, right. But you come here and you discover these people, and it's notable, or noteworthy, I should say, that I dedicated this book to a chap called Standing Bear, Chief Standing Bear, who was a Ponca, a Native American from the Ponca tribe, which originally was in what is now Nebraska. And he, it's a long and complicated story, but he effectively took his case about how he was regarded in law to the Supreme Court, which decided in 1879, so not too long ago, that he was a human being and he had civil rights. Up to that point, Native Americans were regarded in law in this country effectively like squirrels or prairie dogs, which allowed this concept of terra nullius to invade everything, which allowed people to take away their land without hesitation, that they believed they had a legal right so to do. So terra nullius, which is now, of course, doesn't operate at all anymore, but it did it. And it took indigenous peoples to be accorded the same rights as the people who took their land. And it is interesting to remember that in this country, Native Americans, and this after all is their country, weren't allowed to vote until the 1920s. I mean, to me as an outsider and a great lover of this country and now a citizen of this country, I found that rather difficult to believe. Mm. So yes, terra nullius, a very, very important concept for settler colonists, yes.
And so Europeans came here and they appropriated the land, and then they started carving it up into private parcels. And so I wanted to go back to your chapter on the carving up of the commons, which you write about in England. I don't remember the year or the era. Was that in the, you can remember what year that first began?
I certainly do, yes. No, the story effectively begins in the 16th, the late 15th and early 16th century. Up to that point, most land in England, and we're talking about it down at the granular level. I mean, huge estates were, it is true, given by kings to soldiers who waged war for them all. But as far as individual people owning land, that didn't happen. So if I can just draw a picture of a small village in, let's say, Yorkshire, or Dorset, where I came from, where I grew up, 20 houses, let's say, and all the fields around them were open fields. So all of that land was what was called common land. The people who lived in those 20 houses and who raised cattle or chickens or pigs or grew turnips or lettuce or cabbages or whatever, they would plant them wherever they wanted. And that was all fine and dandy. No one owned any land, and all the villagers used all the land as they wished. And that was fine in the early days of England, but then the population began to grow for a variety of reasons. And it turned out that the open fields and the common land idea was highly inefficient in producing food, because the cattle would trample on the cabbages and the pigs would eat the turnips, and something had to be done about it. And so some unnamed person in the 16th century started saying, look, this land can't be owned by everyone. This tract here can be enclosed, and this is the crucial word, enclosure, with a hedge or a ditch or a line of stones or something, separated from this piece of land there, and you put all the cattle on that land, and that'll be superintended or owned by farmer A, and the cabbages would be put in this field here, owned by farmer B. And so the land would no longer be held in common by all the villagers, would be owned by a small number of the villagers. Well, this idea produced much more efficient farming relatively quickly, such that by, and the crucial year is 1604, and the crucial village is a place in Dorset called Radipole. And I remember Radipole quite vividly because I went to a boarding school in a town called Dorchester, and Radipole was 3 miles away, and used to go on cross-country runs. I mean, I hated the place because you had to puff and pant when I was not very good at cross-country running, through the fields of Radipole. But that's an important village because in 1604, Parliament in London said the land in Radipole is going to be enclosed into 11 separately held pieces of land. And if there was a parliamentary bill printed in London, tacked to the door of the church with instructions that if the villagers objected, they could write to Parliament. I mean, good luck with that. Otherwise, it would go into effect. And so suddenly, in the summer of 1604 rather, the land in Radipole was no longer common land, it was owned privately. And that meant there were a lot of people in Radipole, which was a village of about 200 people back then, who no longer owned any land, and they had nowhere to put their cattle or their pigs or their chickens if they owned the chickens or the cattle or the pigs. And so they were quite literally dispossessed. So what did they do? Well, they grumbled a lot, of course, but they also decided, well, let's go off to the nearby cities of Bristol or Liverpool or London and leave the countryside, which is clearly now being run by a gang of sort of aristocratic, people with connections or whatever. Mm. And so they were dispossessed. And one of the things they did was, a small number of them, but a growing number in the 17th and 18th centuries, they started to go to these new lands that had been discovered, and in which, thanks to the principles of terra nullius, there was land available for the taking. And so they crossed, let us say, the Atlantic Ocean to arrive on the shores of Virginia or Massachusetts or wherever they landed. And they knew about this idea of ownership. They knew that it was now possible to own land, and they had been dispossessed themselves. So they were angry and embittered. And what did they set about doing? Landing in this country and dispossessing other people. And so the whole thing became cyclical. And the thing that originated in Dorset, for reasons which initially were quite sensible, improving the food supply of the nation, became a tool of settler colonialism.
Now, did that land that was first carved up in Radipole, did that go to whoever had the best idea on how to manage it, or did it go to people who had power within the community?
It had the latter, its connections. I mean, Britain, well, like many countries in the world, I mean, the word in Chinese is guangxi. If you've got guangxi, if you've got connections, then the people who are connected get the privileges. So I wouldn't say that the land in Radipole was necessarily given to the most efficient farmers, but it was given to the people who had, privilege and contacts and knew the member of parliament who was in Westminster and so on and so forth. I mean, don't get me started on the British class system. It's one of the many reasons that I came to the United States, but it's the landed gentry in England, and these families that then owned the land in Radipole would become part of the landed gentry.
But this is still owned by the Queen on behalf of God, but they had an overlay title, right?
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, in a sense, and I don't mean to dismiss the old lady, but you can forget her because it's only in paper that she owns it. Your ownership of it is essentially total. I mean, it's immalleable, it's transmissible. So you very, very seldom have to worry that the Queen will say, actually, I'd like that back. It doesn't happen. It does occasionally. It does occasionally. I mean, in England, it's called compulsory purchase. And there's always a row about it, and there's always compensation paid. But it is a reminder that ultimately she does own it, but it doesn't happen very often.
Now, this is a seminal moment in world history, not just British history, when this happened with the enclosures. And people have gone back and said this was the beginning of the capitalistic system. And other writers have said this is where we became more capitalist and less socialist. And people have written papers about this, and it's part of it's the foundation for an argument about which works better, capitalism or socialism. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, the Enclosures Act meant that, let's say, the idea has transmitted itself to Virginia or to Montana or wherever. You now own, thanks to this historical event, you own 100 or 50 acres or whatever in the American Midwest or West. You can then go to because there is this idea that land is immutable. It's not going anywhere. They're not, quote, they're not making any more of it, which is, of course, actually not true. You can take it to the bank and use it as collateral for a loan to buy yourself a horse or a tractor or a car or a refrigerator. So it's absolutely central to the capitalist system. I mean, I was going to begin the book, well, not to write an epigraph, taken from Gone with the Wind, and that marvelous moment when Gerald O'Hara on his horse comes jumping over the fences, and there is Scarlett moping about by the river, and he gets off his horse, what's the problem? And she's saying, no, Ashley has run off with somebody else. I'm going to sell Tara. And he's really angry, and he says, under no circumstances must you dream of selling Tara, because land is the only thing worth working for, the only thing worth living for, the only thing worth fighting for, the only thing worth dying for, because land is the only thing that lasts. Well, in the end, we decided, because Gone with the Wind is not a film that one really wants to quote much from these days, and we changed it to a more anodyne quote from Anthony Trollope when he said, land is the only thing that can't fly away. Well, both of those things are true or were true, and maybe we'll talk about this in a moment, but everything's changed now because of the phenomenon of climate change and global warming and sea level rise, which means that land actually is disappearing slowly, but it is disappearing. So the idea that land is immutable and consequently and deservedly the basis of the capitalist system, that idea is disappearing rapidly because land is disappearing, not so rapidly, but disappearing nonetheless.
Now you're talking here about, in order to carve up the world, we needed to map it essentially. And you talk about something called the Struve geodetic arc, and how this was the first effort to divide the world, is that right, into into lines, latitude and longitude to understand it and to eventually own it?
Well, this man called Friedrich von Struve, who came from Estonia, who was essentially part of Western Russia in those days, and we're talking about the 19th century. The Tsar, Alexander I, said, look, to make a good map of anywhere in the world, and we're going to have to make a lot of maps because people are buying land like crazy, we've got to know the measurement of the world. We've got to know how big the world is, because you can't draw a truly accurate map without knowing the size of the planet of which your map is going to be an illustration of a part. So how to measure that? Well, the way you measure the circumference of the planet is to take a meridian, one of the lines that runs from pole to pole, like the Greenwich meridian, and measure the length of it. Well, how do you do that? You select a bit of it, let's say an eighth of it, 4,000 or 5,000 miles long, and you measure its length very accurately. And you do that by using geometry and the principle of triangles. I won't go into it and bore everybody to sleep, but this man von Struve said, okay, he was an astronomer, I can do this, it'll take me some years, and I will do it on the 25th parallel east of Greenwich, from a place called Hammerfest in northern Norway down to Odessa on the Black Sea. And he did it by using these theodolites, the kind of thing you see nowadays. They're sort of yellow laser devices on tripods, which you see people operating by the roads. Back in the 19th century, they were enormous devices made of brass and huge telescopes on them and measuring graticules and things. And they would, with a team of assistants, Struve would lug these things through the forests of Latvia and Finland and Sweden and the Ukraine and Western Russia, measuring lines, putting up towers so that they could sight these theodolites over the trees to the next hill or wherever, cairn or wherever you were measuring it to. And it took him the better part of 40 years. And he said, okay, I've measured now with an accuracy of just a few inches this line from Hammerfest to Odessa. And if you extrapolated, the Earth is 40,008.356 or something kilometers in circumference. And two things to be said about that. That was in the 19th century. In the 2nd century BC, the Greek astronomer called Eratosthenes, working in Egypt, because Egypt at the time was a Greek colony, measured the angle of the sun at noon, falling into a well in Alexandria, and falling at a slightly different angle in a well in Aswan, about 700 miles upstream, up the Nile from Alexandria. And from that, he was able to compute the circumference of the Earth, which he said, obviously he didn't use kilometers because they hadn't been invented yet, but in cubits, he measured it and said it would be the equivalent of 39,500 kilometers. In other words, more than 2 millennia before Struve, a Greek astronomer had got it nearly right. And nowadays, you can get it right using GPS and satellites and so forth. And it's now measured to millimeters. We now know how big the world is to 2 or 3 millimeters. And now, of course, because of that, we can draw exquisitely accurate maps. But the thing about Struve now is that about 20 years ago, someone was walking through a forest in Latvia or Estonia and came across in the forest a stone with an X chiseled onto it. And he realized that this was a base mark of one of Struve's original points along this meridian. So he went through the forest and found others north and south at that point and got in touch with the United Nations and said, you know, this is a forgotten piece of world history, hugely important, but completely forgotten. We ought to declare it a UN World Heritage Site. And so about 10 years ago, it was made a World Heritage Site and now attracts tourists, not many. The Struve geodetic arc does not rank with the pyramids and the Empire State Building or Yellowstone, but it is up there, one of the great wonders of the modern world.
You've spent time in the West. I presume some of the reporting for this book you came out here, and you also owned land at one time in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana. You must have a fondness for the American West. And tell us a little bit about about some of the big landowners, like the Wilkes brothers out here, who own what, 750,000 acres? Is that right?
Well, I'm very interested to hear, Jim, on your views of the Wilkes brothers. I mean, the biggest, forgetting the Queen for a moment, the biggest private landowner in the world is an Australian woman called Gina Rinehart. She owns huge tracts of Western Australia, most of which is iron ore country. In America, the two biggest landowners are both television moguls, Ted Turner and John Malone. Ted Turner's lands are mainly in the West. John Malone owns a substantial amount. They both own about 2 million acres. Much of his recent acquisitions have been in Maine and New Hampshire forest land. But then come along these two chaps, the Wilkes brothers. They, young men from West Texas, who made a fortune from the chemicals that are put into fracking liquids. And they were bought out 7 or 8 years ago now, I think it was, by the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund for $4.something billion. So all of a sudden, these two young boys, effectively, Dan and Faris Wilkes, had $2 billion each, not really knowing what to spend it on. So they decided, perhaps having seen Gone with the Wind, I don't know, that they would buy land. And so they went on a spree of buying land in Idaho, Montana, I believe, Wyoming, Colorado. But from what I've read, and I tried to get in touch with them, they do not like people like me. In fact, very difficult. I don't think there are any pictures of them in the book because they've copyrighted most pictures of themselves and bought the copyright back. They have been criticized for banning people from the land, closing off forest roads, putting barriers, security cameras, hiring security men, and contravening, in the view of many Western people, the spirit of Western America, which is that you've got this beautiful, beautiful landscape which people should be allowed to enjoy. And the idea of putting up barbed wire fences and security cameras is anathema, even though, of course, they have the legal right to do so. So to my way of thinking, the Wilkes brothers are not necessarily a force for good. And I'd be very interested to hear, Jim, I don't want to get you into trouble, but whether you share my views or, I mean, are they well known in Montana?
Oh, yes, they are. And Ted Turner is even more well known. He owns a lot of land here. And it's kind of broken the code of the West, if you will, where a mindset where people could, if they asked permission or if they didn't, often access private land to hunt or to fish. And not always, but there was a kind of an uneasy relationship between landowners and people who would hunt and fish. But new owners have brought a much more rigid mindset to that, and they don't allow people to access it. Some places now, nothing is absolute, but by and large, the out-of-state owners have tried to. I'm thinking of someone who's fenced off rivers, which is a big no-no here in Montana because it's owned by the public and they have the right to access it. So it's definitely changed that relationship, and the Wilkes brothers are very much a part of that that change in how private lands are regarded in the West, and in some places they own a lot of the land. I mean, it almost in places for miles along the road. And what it does also is it blocks off access for people to public land, which they might have to drive through to get there. And there have been numerous fights over easements that have been blocked off by private landowners like that, who don't want people driving across their land to get to public land. So they effectively control this public land by virtue or by dint of the fact that they own the access. Those fights are still going on.
I became very interested in writing this book about the whole concept of trespass.
Right. Well, that gets, we have just a few minutes here until we have question and answers. But let me ask one more question about kind of summing up along these lines. And that is, well, if ownership of land is freighted with all of these problems and history and so on, what are the alternatives? What are the other models out there that for private land or for land where people can manage it in a way that's different than Ted Turner or the Wilkes brothers or the Queen?
Well, interestingly enough, these new models are coming to seem increasingly attractive. For a start, there is, and I just mentioned trespass briefly, in more or less all of Scandinavia, there is this idea of what's, to use the Swedish word, allemansrätten, which is all men's right, which says in law that providing you behave yourself, every Swedish person has a right to wander across any land, no matter who owns it. They can't come into your living room and demand a cup of coffee, and they can't sit in your garden and sunbathe. But if you own 1,000 acres, 100 acres, they can walk across it, they can camp on it, they can hunt and fish on it. So long as they behave themselves, there is a code, and most Swedes and Norwegians and Danes and Finns do abide by that. Now that has spread now to Scotland and to a certain slightly lesser extent to England as well. And in Scotland, and I'm aware that the clock is ticking, but there is this concept now of community land ownership, where if a large tract of land is sold, or is up for sale now, land that had been privately owned by, let's say, one person. I use an illustration of an island owned by one family. If it's put on the market now, the first dibs in that sale must go not to a private individual, but to a community. And you can form a community, 50 people, 40 people can say, we are a community and we'd like to bid for the land. And they are often given a grant of money by the Scottish government to help them buy this land, or this island in this particular case. So in that case, the result of this, slowly, Scotland, which used to be, there was a very famous theatre company called the 784 Theatre Company, a radical theatre company, which parodied or illustrated the fact that 7% of the people own 84% of the land. That is changing now, because the law in Scotland is suggesting that communities own land rather than individuals. And it's happening here where I live. I mean, today I'm in New York City, but I normally live in Western Massachusetts. The next village to me, which is called New Marlborough, has a New Marlborough community landowning body, which now you can give your land to in your will. So you own 500 acres. I've enjoyed using it. Now I'm going to give it to the New Marlborough Land Trust. They will pledge that in perpetuity. They'll leave it sacrosanct. They won't allow any development, but they will allow people onto it. And so slowly the picture is changing. Private ownerships in New England, in Vermont, New Hampshire, well, Vermont and Massachusetts principally. The private landowner is slowly diminishing in importance, and community land ownership is a growing thing. So it's a phenomenon which is, it's green shoots of a revolution, but it is beginning at least, and it'll be interesting to see whether it spreads beyond New England.
It's happening here in the West. Actually, Montana's grounds for a lot of community land trusts. Here we have the Prickly Pear Land Trust, and there's others in Bozeman and Missoula that are buying up and taking on as much land as they can, because the community, these communities are very active, outdoor communities. People run and they bike and they hunt and they fish, and they want land to recreate on around town. I mean, there's public land, Forest Service and BLM and so on, but it's nice to have places right around town where most of the land is private, or much of the land. So it has been a revolution here as well, and in other places. So it's.
Can I ask you, I know we obviously let people ask questions, but I'm interested to know how in Montana the appointment of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior is being regarded, the first ever Native American to hold that post. Is it regarded symbolically as important?
It is important, definitely, and the Indian community is very happy to see this. It's a very hugely symbolic for them. Now, one of our last secretaries of Interior was from Montana as well, and but it's a whole different mood now. And of course, there's been a huge shift in policy, in public land policy. So that's part of it as well. I mean, the Trump administration's effort was to undo as many protections as possible for oil and gas and mining and so on. And now we have kind of a flip side of that. So that's part of the package as well. But yes, people are very happy to see a woman, and a Native American woman to boot, doing something like this. So I have a question here I just saw come up on the screen. I'm gonna look at that and take that. Can you discuss what the situation in Africa is with regards to land in Asia? I love your book, but it does have a particularly American Anglo view.
Yes, well, I initially did not cover much about Africa because it's so complex and in many ways so desperately sad as well. But in the end, my editor said, we need Africa. And I used to live in Africa. I used to live in Uganda. So I have a very fond feeling, certainly for East Africa. Well, it's a complex situation. I mean, in the chapter on Africa, I reproduced that infamous cartoon, which was in Punch magazine, showing Cecil Rhodes striding across Africa with one boot in Cape Town and one boot in Cairo, showing illustratively how settler colonialists, most of them Europeans, of course, the English, the French, the Germans, the Portuguese, and the Belgians, notoriously, had gigantic tracts of land, which they did not start to return them to the people whose country this was until the 20th century, generally speaking. And the famous speech by Harold Macmillan in South Africa, "The wind of change is blowing through Africa." And one by one, these countries, quite rightly, won their independence. And in our case, the British left, the Spanish left places like Equatorial Guinea, the Germans left what is now Namibia and what was Tanganyika. And effectively, Africa is now run by Africans. And there were attempts to make sure that the white landowners that remained in a place like Zimbabwe, say, which used to be Southern Rhodesia, were persuaded to give up their lands, and they were offered financial compensation to give up their lands. And regrettably, the funds that were allocated were often misused. There was a great deal of corruption, and a lot of the land was forcibly removed from the European farmers. And the consequences in Zimbabwe particularly are notorious. I mean, we all know about what's happened there and a lot of brutality and unpleasantness. Some countries have fared better than others. I mean, the Nigeria's, particularly southern and central Nigeria, pretty good. The former French possessions, Côte d'Ivoire, pretty good. East Africa, generally, Kenya, Uganda, the situation is pretty reasonable, but nonetheless, there's something like 500 million acres of African land which has not been set to agriculture and always been very inefficiently slash and burn farmed in a continent where gigantic numbers of people are below the UN designated poverty line. So there's a lot of work still to be done, but it has to be said, we've got to face it squarely, that the fault of all this lies with European colonial powers. We shouldn't have taken the land in the first place. And when we left, we should have done so with some more original thinking about how the land is reapportioned. I mean, still to this day, to beg your pardon.
I was just going to move on to the next question, but go ahead and finish.
No, I was just going to say, if you see a movie, and I begin the chapter with the film, I think it was called White Mischief, about the lives of white settlers in the highlands of Kenya. I mean, it was so decadent and unpleasant and racist, and yet the legacy of land reform that this style of life left behind has not been good for anybody. So Africa is a mess still in many places.
So there's a question here from your horologist in Bozeman, Dave Bergold, your clockmaker friend, who says, how would you regard the future of land ownership or occupation when in the future it will no longer be restricted to Earth?
Well, it's funny you should say that. I've just applied to get Elon Musk's Starlink satellite connection, because where I live in Western Massachusetts, the broadband is very inadequate, which is why I'm doing this call today from New York City. The contract that I signed, you look down, and I seldom, like most of us, seldom look at the fine print. But I did look for some reason at the fine print of an Elon Musk contract. And the final paragraphs, as in all contracts, say which law, which jurisdiction is responsible for this contract, if there's a dispute. And it says it'll be adjudicated in the event of a dispute in California, except in the case of any settlement established on Mars. And there, it is the belief among lawyers on Earth that Mars is a separate legal entity and that a whole new legal set of regulations has to be established for off-Earth living. So people, including Dave of the Last Wind-Up, are thinking keenly, naturally most of the people that are thinking most keenly are lawyers, of a post-terrestrial future with laws that can be applied and adjudicated and argued over.
Oh, interesting.
Well, God help us all.
The whole can of worms there.
Yeah.
Here's a question from a friend of mine who says, can you describe in broad strokes the difference between the ownership paradigm of fee simple versus most indigenous people's concept of land? We talked a little bit about that, but maybe you could unpack that a little more.
Yes, I mean, it varies from country to country and within any country from tribe or nation to nation. Most eloquently, I think it was put by Chief Sealth, the Suquamish chief who in the 1870s or 1880s was persuaded to sell a chunk of the Pacific Northwest to build what is now the city of Seattle, named for him. And his speech, which I reproduce in, I think, the epilogue of the book, says what most Native Americans believed, as far as I understand, because it certainly was believed by the Mohicans and the Lenape and the Iroquois who live in my part of the world, which is that while we superintend the land, while we farm the land, while we hunt on the land, while we practice agriculture on the land, we do not own it. We could no more own this land than you can own the breeze or own the sea. The earth is our mother. You have to cherish her, look after her, and she will look after you. But the idea of ownership, of cutting up into parcels and owning it and preventing other people being on it is, I wouldn't say anathema to us, but is foreign to our way of thinking. And this is true certainly in Australia and true in New Zealand. And New Zealand is where, from what I can gather from researching this book, is where the most interesting developments in land reform are taking place, because New Zealand, the most recently settled of all the major corners of the planet, settled by Polynesians, what, 700-800 years ago, so very recently settled. And then in the early part of the 19th century, along come the French and the Dutch, and then the British, and the British decide to annex it. And there's this famous or infamous treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, where all of a sudden the land hitherto owned by Maoris belongs to Queen Victoria. Well, ever since then, and most notably since the 1970s, the Maoris have been trying to get their land back, and slowly they are getting it back. So I noticed that Suzanne has come back on the screen, which is an indication that I better stop talking. But the land reform that is going on in New Zealand is going on at great pace, and it's profound. And no longer is New Zealand a little island of Britishness set down in the South Seas. It is an entirely new-made Maori Polynesian country, no longer called New Zealand. It's now called New Zealand Aotearoa, which means land of the long white cloud. No longer do they sing God Save the Queen, they sing God Defend New Zealand, the first verse in Maori, and Maoris are getting their land back. So now
you have a quote in your book that I liked. It said, to each of these native people, land was a commodity so precious and so life-giving, it was indeed to be shared by all and owned by none. And I think that's how you feel that the world is moving in this direction. Eh?
I think it is. I mean, the Wilkes brothers may be digging in their spurs, but I think in time, everyone will see sense and no one will own land privately.
Oh, thank you both so much. This was such a wonderful evening. I appreciate you very much coming out tonight, and thank you very much to all of our attendees. We're just about out of time, so I will, again, thank you very, very much, and I hope everyone has a great evening. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, very much indeed.
You're welcome, Simon. Thank you.